Good afternoon and welcome back to the live stream. Thank you for joining me. I do hope everybody is doing well today. Enjoying your week so far? I've certainly been appreciating the sunshine. It's a tiny bit gentler on the temperature today. I mean, we were crossing 30 degrees the last 2 days. Today we're comfortably in the mid-20s, which I think a little more enjoyable, a little bit gentler. I can actually close the window when the cars are getting too loud outside without dying, and I very much appreciate that. Today we're going to be doing a little bit more brainstorming, sort of loosely following on from the stream last week where we discussed the comparison between magic systems and potential equivalent tech systems that you might see in sci-fi, whether the sort of idea of a power system applies the same way in that genre as it does in fantasy with the growing popularity of magic systems. And the overall conclusion we came to was that, yeah, broadly speaking, the concept still applies. It doesn't have the same kind of codified understanding as it does in fantasy, but some of the ways of thinking and the approaches are still useful in sci-fi as well. Since then, I have had a few videos cross my recommendations on YouTube relating to tabletop RPG design and how to lay those out, how to do the stats and abilities and such, what kind of progression system and dice system to use, and the one that kind of got me thinking a bit was what and how many classes to include in a tabletop RPG. And that did get me thinking because I tend to get easily distracted, so as soon as I saw this I was like, what would I do if I were building my own tabletop RPG? Let's note some ideas down. And then I quickly realized that there just don't seem to be quite as many easy, transferable, general use touchstones for sci-fi as there are for fantasy. There's just not so much to draw on that you can simply drop into any given world. So what I wanted to do today was take a little time to look at some of those fantasy staples and then consider how I might go about translating them over into sci-fi. I want to look at sort of tabletop RPG style classes / archetypes, classic creatures, and locations, and see how fantasy and sci-fi compare in these. Starting off with classes and archetypes. In fantasy, you have, for example, your fighter, basic guy with a sword, does, fightery stuff. And a fighter is relevant and applicable in pretty much any sort of fantasy setting, right? Like, if you're writing a story, perhaps, that's specifically a fantasy murder mystery where you're dealing with detectives and stuff, maybe you won't have a standard fighter, you'll have guards and stuff around, but essentially these people are dude with swords. That is a character archetype in fantasy. If you roll up into any fantasy game, whether it's high fantasy or something really gritty, if it's grimdark, if it's low fantasy, if it's sword and sorcery, whatever, a guy with a weapon is an archetype in any of those. Similarly, even if you're doing like a very medieval Europe focused knights in shining armor kind of medieval fantasy, the barbarian archetype kind of also exists there. Because there is a certain expectation and implication in a fantasy setting that draws so heavily on real life that the rest of the world also does exist beyond the borders of a map. So someone coming from a foreign land where the barbarian archetype fits, so for classic medieval fantasy that would probably be some like northern land, like a Viking style character or something like that. Having a barbarian show up would work in basically any fantasy kind of setting. Obviously you have your wizards, and then branching off from those, depending on how you want to do it, you know, witches, warlocks, sorcerers, the different flavors of magic users. I imagine a lot of people's understanding of what these are and what they do, how they work, will have been impacted a lot within the tabletop RPG space by D&D and its prevalence. There'll be certain expectations of what each of these does that come from there. But generally speaking, they'll fit anywhere, right? Like if it's fantasy, you can have a fantasy setting with no magic. I couldn't name one off the top of my head, but you can do it. But even there, having someone come along who is just kind of like a real world mystic, wise man kind of archetype, who at least thinks they're doing magic or wants people to believe they're doing magic, still works. Any fantasy setting, a wizard is a thing you can throw in there. Yeah, so fighters, barbarians, wizards. If you've got gods in your setting, then the clergy, so paladin, cleric, etc. Those kind of characters, they all fit into basically any fantasy setting. No one's gonna bat an eye, no matter what kind of world you're writing, if you include gods. Whether they be present gods, like provable ones that interact with the world and stuff, or if it's just religions that exist. I think, to the best of my knowledge, the world of Game of Thrones does a mix of that, right? Like you have some people who follow certain beliefs or whatever, and they can actually draw power through various means. But I think, if I remember rightly, it's unclear whether that's actually coming from a god or if that's just them doing magic that they happen to have dressed up as a faith. And then there's also some religions in our world where there's no way to know whether the gods that they worship are real or not. But either way, having this kind of character archetype, the paladin, the cleric, in a fantasy setting just kind of works. And even honestly, if we want to be a little looser with this, even if they don't work in every fantasy setting, if you're trying to come up with characters you can put into a world with inspiration for what sort of characters you might want to include, these are all options that you can draw from. If we turn then instead to sci-fi, character archetype wise, the equivalent of the fighter, I guess, is a fighter but with guns, essentially. Standard soldier character, mercenary, whatever you want to call them. That one's pretty straightforward. But then the barbarian? Do we have that really in sci-fi? Because you can look at the practical, technical level of this, of what is it that they're actually, you know, what role do they fulfill in combat, if you want to look at that kind of perspective of it, the almost wargaming tabletop RPG lens, then sure, you can have a big buff guy with, I don't know, like a shotgun or a Gatling gun, and that's your stand-in for the barbarian, but that's just a guy who happens to have a big gun. It doesn't come with all of the ideas of a character archetype that the barbarian does. For the magic users, you can have the psionic And that has certain tropes and ideas attached to it, right? Like the psionic tends to be usually a calm and cool character, might have issues with controlling their emotions and therefore their powers. You know the character. It's I was going to say like Raven from Teen Titans, but Raven from Teen Titans explicitly does magic with her powers. She's not a psionic, but there you see kind of the overlap between the archetypes. Like it's the magic user, they draw power from their mind stuff, they're kind of a strange individual, usually very distant. You see the picture. The clergy character archetypes? Not really. Outside of perhaps Warhammer 40,000, which is very much a science fantasy setting, like magic is, we can dress it up as being the psionic powers drawn from the warp, which is everybody's collective unconsciousness, but it's magic, right? Like it's magic, and the Inquisition and stuff like that in that world is very much a fantasy organization. Outside of that, I know you get religious characters in sci-fi settings, but they're not a character archetype, right? You can tell someone about a paladin in a sci-fi setting, and I imagine most people's first thought in that instance is going to be, oh, so like a fantasy paladin, but in space. It's not going to be like, oh, a paladin, I know what this looks like in space. It's a big guy in a suit of armor with a sword that does holy smites, whatever they might happen to look like. That's not a sci-fi archetype. But that's why I want to put on here that isn't just repeating D&D classes. A lot of it is. I suppose you could have sort of the monk Jedi pairing. Does the monk archetype exist in sci-fi without the massive cultural influence of Star Wars? I want to say it probably doesn't. I think the self-control, because that kind of draws from the psionic side again, of the self-control, temper your emotions, control your mind, sort of Vulcan mind trick type of deal. Maybe that's the alternative. Is the sci-fi equivalent of character archetypes species archetypes? So the barbarian is the Klingon, will you say the monk is the Vulcan? The Vulcan more of a wizard or a monk? Wizard / monk. The Volk. Yeah, that pattern kind of follows. You tend to have in some sci-fi, very Planet of Hats kind of species, and some of them do map onto fantasy archetypes. A bard, that's probably musically inclined races. You could make an equivalent for a lot, but are they a character archetype? Probably not. The Klingons, the warlike race, appears in more universes. Are they called... was it a Krogan in Mass Effect? Yeah, the Krogan. The Klingon, the Krogan... what else? What other sort of portrayed as brutish and warlike races do we have? I don't know how accurate that is in Mass Effect. I must admit I've never played those. I only have a vague idea of anything that happens in those games, but I do believe the Krogans are like that. What are the guys called in Doctor Who who've got 3 fingers? The Centaurian? Doctor Who... Sontaran? The Sontaran. Not quite the same archetype as this, not quite really a barbarian character, but the warlike species. The warlike species, and then the wizard/monk, the logical species, who usually have psychic powers. There we go. Yeah, Bard's not really a proper equivalent for, you'd have to make one up. Let's have a look on TV tropes. TV tropes. Fantasy character archetype. What do we have? Another discussion. Stock characters? That's the kind of thing we're looking for. Ah, but these are fairly broad. Yeah, okay, here we go. The Black Mage, the Paladin, the Bard, right, the Thief, the Rogue, Thief, etc. The Healer. What else? A Fighter, Mage, and variations. Yes, exactly. A Knight, a Warrior, Swashbuckler. These call to mind extremely specific images. You read the name of these and you immediately have in your mind like, oh yeah, that's going to, you know, this is roughly how this person's going to look like. If someone explains to you a sci-fi setting, a fantasy setting, and then says, oh, and we're going to have this, and this archetype, you can immediately think to yourself, oh yeah, they roughly look like this. In this kind of setting, they're going to function like this and this and this. It's very clear. Oh, okay, so TV Tropes does have a sci-fi section for this as well. The soldier, yeah. Heavy, a machine gunner, demolitionist. Okay, that's definitely one. We'll stick that on the list. The demolition expert / mechanic. The pilot. The ace pilot, that's definitely a very big sci-fi sort of class / character archetype. One of the few where I think you don't really see an equivalent in fantasy. But like the mechanic, you know, the artificer is very big in fantasy. It's just kind of the appeal of that modern knowledge of technology, and then you want to mash that in together with the magic, and the artificer is born of that. So they're really popular and included in more and more what would otherwise be very true fantasy works, getting that kind of slight modern spin with an artificer here and there. Demolitions expert as well, you know, the mad scientist, the goblin tinkerer throwing alchemical brews around the place. Not really a thing in fantasy though, is the pilot, the ace pilot. That's a very big trope in sci-fi. I mean, off the top of my head, if we have like Luke Skywalker in Star Wars, or we have oh, what is she called? The one from Battlestar Galactica. Oh, it's been so long since I watched that, the name escapes me. But that's a very big character archetype. There we go. I can speak sometimes. Sniper, yes. then the archer is kind of just as big on the other side. Scout, stealth / Black Ops. You can have stealth and, you know, rogues and sneaky people in fantasy, but the Black Ops, the operative, the covert operative, that's a very sci-fi / modern day kind of archetype. The support, medic, buffer, supplier. Yeah, medic. The sci-fi equivalent to the healer. The buffer. Sometimes officers are not the best fighters. Buffers help their allies become better fighters. They increase the damage of their allies, sometimes also increasing their defensive speed. From a game design perspective, you do get stuff like this. I've recently seen some gameplay from Warhammer Rogue Trader. I think that has kind of classes that follow this kind of line of thought. Yeah, an officer type character is definitely a thing, but that's not sci-fi exclusive. The commander giving buffs to their troops is a thing you see in both. The supplier, maybe. An armorer is kind of a thing in fantasy as well. The blacksmith, kind of the equivalent to the weapon maintenance kind of guy. The techie, the engineer, the scientist. The hacker, yes. The hacker. The hacker almost operates separate from the mage archetype, right? Because that would kind of be the comparison. In certain sci-fi or cyberpunk settings, a hacker provides a very similar role to a magician, with, you know, debuffing enemies and getting access to things that no one else can touch, sort of moving in a space that is inaccessible to the rest of the cast, a world that they don't really exist in. Is the same thing the hacker does, but I feel like character archetype wise they do embody a different role than the wizard does. I think if you were going to pick, you'd probably put the wizard for the psionic, for bending reality and changing the way things work, more than you would for the hacker necessarily. I suppose maybe the psionic is more of a wizard and the hacker is more of maybe the sorcerer? Because it's still very much a learning-based, understanding-based, and you can see here my bias slipping in, because I do view these archetypes through a very D&D lens, where the wizard is the int-based caster who learns their spells and does the rituals and rites and stuff, whereas the sorcerer draws power from their bloodline. But that's not necessarily the case. It can just mean magic. All of these can just mean magic of a different sort. Rarer classes. The Mystic. Yeah, the Jedi. The Magic class. Psionics. And the Face. Yes, the Driver. The Pilot Base. The Driver, I mean, a getaway driver, I suppose, but that's not a sci-fi thing, that's just a modern day thing. In theory, you could have a getaway driver in a fantasy setting, but it's more likely that everyone hops on their own horse rather than jumping in a carriage and one person does the driving. As soon as you get cars, you get bank heists and getaway drivers. Actually, even a Wild West setting with carriages and stuff will have a getaway driver, won't it? If you're inclined, if you're inclined to do a heist kind of scenario in that kind of setting. Okay. So there's a decent amount. We have definitely some sci-fi archetypes, some of which you can even loosely map back onto the fantasy side of things. And of course the consideration of this, but as a world building community online, we're all kind of moving away from this approach and the idea of a planet of hats and stuff like that, and I think rightfully so. I don't think this is overall not a good approach. Leaving this behind for a minute then, and looking over to creatures. Off the top of my head, like when I was thinking about this idea as a concept for something to go over on stream, off the top of my head I was thinking of, like, you know, dragons, krakens, giants, you know, those kind of things that are very recognizable. You know exactly what you're looking at, what you're dealing with, what its deal is, things you can expect from it. They might not always be true, they might be subverted in certain cases, but there's this fairly strong baseline, right? Like, the dragon is dangerous, it flies, it breathes fire, it hoards gold. The kraken sinks ships on the open seas. Giants, giants less so, but they do still have a fairly strong presence. It tends to be one of two ways. You've got, like, the very hierarchical, sort of Norse-inspired giants, and then you have, like, Jack and the Beanstalk eats people giants. Those tend to be the two main types that I see, at least. Just gonna take a sip real quick. But then it doesn't all have to be big major creatures you plonk down somewhere. You can also have the small things, you know, the basic mobs, your slimes, your goblins, your classic creatures like mimics, that kind of stuff. Trying to make sure that I don't get too D&D centric. Like, for example, I think Illithids are pretty much a D&D thing. They're very classic there, but very much D&D. I think the Beholder is a D&D thing. I'm not sure that those pop up in anything else. I don't know, does Wizards of the Coast have a copyright on the Beholder? Can you make Beholders elsewhere? I do not know. But yes, there's these, there's more, you know, classic monsters like vampires and werewolves, etc, etc. On the sci-fi side of things, you get the giant sandworm. That's very sci-fi, I think. They're not non-existent in fantasy, but the giant sandworm, that's a sci-fi thing. I mean, we're just in the revival of Dune as a franchise with the Fantastic Dune movies. I hear apparently the TV show's not very good, but I haven't seen that. And the video game, I think, just came out a couple of weeks ago. But I saw some people play, apparently pretty good, people are liking it. But yeah, you get the giant sandworm. You get the psychic entity, you know, the kind of warp storm style creature. The symbiote / parasite, those pop up. They're not super common, but common enough. Some variation of space whale you see in places. What else? The living planet. That's one that you see from time to time. And that feels kind of like that's it, right? I guess an AI. Ancient and malfunctioning. Rogue. Sending. you know, various stages of AI. As I mentioned last week, I was watching Mandalore Gaming's videos on Marathon. I've had AI on the brain. Oh, speaking of Marathon, I've been terribly disappointed because I don't play shooting games, but looking at the art style, I was really quite excited for the new Marathon game that's in development. Only to now find out that apparently, now that people have gotten access to it, they've been overall left rather unimpressed with the gameplay overall. The extraction shooter style, I think it was, gameplay has not managed to capture people. They apparently didn't do very good on that. And now it's come out that some of the artists have been plagiarizing, and that's kind of killed a lot of enthusiasm for the art style as well, so it looks like the game might just kind of be a flop, which is a massive shame, because aside from like the couple decals that ended up being copied, the rest of the art style is fantastic, and I was honestly considering getting into shooting games specifically to play Marathon, only to now find out that apparently it's not great as a game, and this has kind of tainted the art for most people. So that is a absolute shame. It's tragic. Waste of potential. But yeah, so giant sandworm, some kind of psychic entity that pops up somewhere in space, symbiotes, space whales occasionally, living planets very rarely, and I'm including in that like full-on, you know, planet with a face on it style, like in Guardians of the Galaxy, or the more usual, all the plants are connected, or there's a giant mushroom or something in a planet that's alive, that kind of thing. You see it from time to time. And then AI. This was a small representative list. You kind of get your classic big monsters, you get your general mobs that you see everywhere, your super recognizable creatures, and your I want to say classic monsters again, but I've already said classic monsters. But you know, a different kind of classic monster. The vampires and werewolves are in a class of their own in that regard. But this is like a tip of the iceberg. These are representative. You can keep listing stuff and people will know what it is and what it kind of is about in a fantasy setting. In sci-fi, it's not like you can just drop in, you know, angels, demons, vampires, goblins, whatever other stuff that's all perfectly explicable in fantasy. In sci-fi, it's all either alien species, where generally speaking you're called upon to be somewhat more original. You know, we don't want more Planet of Hats type species. We are moving on from that. So you got to come up with ones that have an actual culture and history and something going on. So no easy dropping things in there. Monster-wise, you're super limited. You can maybe also put in the zombie virus. That manages to squeak through as being sci-fi rather than fantasy, right? Resurrected creature, it's under your control, that's a fantasy zombie. They spread via bite and are a plague/infestation, that's your sci-fi zombie. But this is almost more of an exhaustive list. We can maybe squeak in there the crystal species, you know, the silicon based instead of carbon based. They also make an appearance now and then. I imagine if I spent long enough focused on it, really rack my brain for ideas, I might be able to come up with a couple more to stick onto this list. But I believe that kind of shows the conundrum here in terms of the folklore, the modern folklore, the cultural touchstones to draw on for things you can just toss into your fantasy, or things you can take inspiration from and adapt to your specific fantasy world are way, way broader than the equivalents for sci-fi. There's just not as much here. I think even in this, where we managed to get a pretty good list going, in fantasy, most jobs slash characters slash archetypes, most things you can be in a fantasy world come with connotations attached. You know, a herbalist, for example, is, you know, if I say to you a fantasy herbalist, you're picturing someone in a quaint little store with plants all over the place who shows you secret magical herbs and makes you potions, or tells you you've got to find the mandrake roots in order to cure the curse that's been placed on someone. If there's someone who's into herbology and sci-fi, then what, they're doing hydroponics, or they're the tech person, the scientist, yeah? I tell you someone does chemistry or metallurgy or programming or whatever else, they also kind of just still fall under the umbrella of the scientist. I think partially because in a sci-fi setting, things are so much more real and technical as a result that you can't have a scientist who does the thing entirely on their own. They're reliant on a lot of other technology that interacts with theirs. That's why they all kind of get lumped together into a group of scientists who each have a special field and then work together. It is kind of a separate sci-fi story archetype where you have the team of scientists off exploring something, and then you start to look into the specialties. Like each one is their separate thing. Like you have, you know, generally your away team setup, right? You have the biologist, the geologist, the archaeologist, maybe the meteorologist, right? Like the things you need to explore a planet and make some very broad observations about it so you can move the story forward. Gonna take another sip. I don't know how well I'm really getting my idea across here. That, like, you can do these things in sci-fi. You can come up with creatures or whatever and make them fairly recognizable in a sci-fi setting. You can come up with characters and have someone point at them going, oh yeah, I'm looking at this, I know what to expect of this. But you have to do that setup first. You're creating the thing, you're setting expectations, you're guiding the reader into it so that they can draw the correct conclusions from what you present. You do not have the ease of fantasy where you can simply point at something and go, it's this, and that word comes with all of this baggage attached that someone can draw from in order to imagine what kind of thing you're going to show them. I saw a similar point discussed in a decade plus old blog post that was discussing tabletop RPG design, where it talked about different types of worlds, different type of setting in a tabletop RPG. What words did it use to describe them? I don't know what exactly terminology it was, but it split them into two groups basically. One where you describe the world very specifically, like you go, here is this and this city where this and this people live, they do these and these things, this is the world. And then another one where you leave that stuff kind of vague and you just give the impression of this is the type of setting it is. It's up to you, the game master and the players, to fill in the specifics of what cities, what characters, whatever exists in that. And something he brought up there was that you can save yourself a lot of words, a lot of explaining and writing and effort in that second type of world by just saying it's a Wild West and there's cowboys. And those are terms that come with a plethora of expectation. Even if the actual setting you're building might not be a very classical Wild West setting, you might have something that's very far removed from the Wild West, but then you can say, there's a group of people here and they are like cowboys, and from there, your readers, your audience can fill in and make assumptions about that group and just kind of translate the concept of cowboy into your setting of their own accord. And that works really, really well. And you just don't have a lot of that ease and convenience in sci-fi compared to fantasy. And then finally, locations. And this one's almost more of an afterthought compared to the first two categories, but it's one that came to mind for me because when I was doing that little fun exercise after watching those videos of what sort of tabletop RPG would I create, it would be one that's very focused on acquiring and using cool loot. So there would be a lot of traveling to, you know, old ruins and stuff like that and acquiring stuff from them. So what sort of locations can you plonk down in sci-fi and in fantasy is very relevant to me here. So, what type of locations do you have? In fantasy, now what do we count here, right? Like, would a mystic forest slash glade be a valid location? The ancient ruin, a dungeon, the monster lair, the kingdom's capital, because it tends to be the capital city that we're mostly concerned about. The mage tower slash academy, the cult hideout. This feels general enough that it's really not even a specific category, is it? You know, these are just any sort of place that you could possibly build a story around, and if you're determined enough, you can build a story around anything. What does sci-fi have? Sci-fi also has monster lairs. That's actually one of the ones where there is a very strong sci-fi connection, as strong as there is in fantasy. Like in fantasy, the monster lair, you know, your dragon's lair full of gold, or some other place where you got to steal the monster's eggs or whatever else happens to be hidden in their lair. That's the same in sci-fi. Some slimy alien beastie has taken up residence in a wrecked ship that you want to loot because you need to get their records or whatever. That's a very classic sci-fi thing. It's not hard for people to get on board with what's going on there. Yeah, wrecked spaceship, both planet-side and out in space. Abandoned station, that's a very sci-fi one. Megastructure. There we go. What else is very sci-fi? Of abandoned places, just things floating in space. Megastructures. Nothing else particularly comes to mind. I'm gonna think back through every Star Trek episode I've watched and every random thing they encounter. I guess generic anomaly. Whatever happens to be inside, you know, a time warp, wormhole, gravity distortion, whatever stuff like that. anything else? See, if the list is only this short, then maybe I've got to come back to actually fantasy does, indeed, have it easier here as well than sci-fi does. Some of these are transferable. The lab / facility. These are not unheard of in fantasy, but I feel like if you come across one, it's been a very deliberate choice on the part of the author to include that kind of thing in their work. It's not something that's classic to fantasy. It's not something that has the same heavy connotations behind it. More of a sci-fi thing. Really more of a present day fiction thing, right? Be abducted and taken to a lab kind of fiction shows up a lot more in superhero stuff, I think, and a lot more in present day contemporary settings. Urban sci-fi? Is urban sci-fi an equivalent to urban fantasy? I've not actually heard that term before. I think a lot of sci-fi that's near future has its own terms, like cyberpunk. I'm gonna take a drink again. Remember to stay hydrated in this overbearing. Okay, come on, a couple more. What's a good place you can plonk down? I feel like a lot of the stuff in sci-fi where you'd go and send people to explore. Okay, maybe I should narrow this list down actually. Locations you send a party to explore or do a thing. Do a thing, like carry out a mission, kind of makes it everywhere. So locations you send a party to explore or retrieve something. Uninhabited location. There we go. You take off the capital. We'll count the cold hideout. I think the cold ritual there. Uninhabited by people. There we go. We can keep sticking caveats on until it works. What ritual chamber complex? Hideout. Put hideout back. I also has one says here, wrecked spaceships, abandoned stations, anomaly, labs and facility. Yeah, I think that's pretty clear. Okay, so this last one is probably not as difficult. There's really a few overarching archetypes of location that lots of other stuff falls under. Like lots, you know, the monster lair, the cold hideout, the ancient ruin. You could wrap those all under the label of dungeon if you really wanted to, based on how they function. So they have got different aesthetics and stuff, but you can do the same in sci-fi depending on whether the abandoned place you're exploring is a lab or a industrial area or whatever else. So in this regard, probably sci-fi and fantasy are going fairly even. In the other two, I think fantasy has a definite advantage. There's really a lot more here that fantasy can easily draw on for its inspiration. We're about an hour in, and I finished my drink, so what I think I'm going to do is head downstairs for just a couple of minutes, grab myself a new drink, stretch a little, and then come back and move on to whatever part 2 of this is going to be, because actually it seems we made our way through this part of it very quickly. So let me switch on over to here and I will be back shortly. Right, I'm back. Ooh, it is getting hot again. It was kinda gentle this morning because it was cloudy and there was a nice breeze. Now the wind has completely stopped and all the clouds have faded and the afternoon sun is not being gentle. It's getting hotter and hotter. They actually recommend that you close your windows and close your blinds, keep the light out, and then only open the windows in the morning and evening to let a little bit of the cooler air inside at those times. Pretty rough. If we start getting summers like this more consistently, thanks to global warming, then I'm gonna want to invest in an air conditioning unit. Not that that will help the larger problems, but it's kind of miserable sometimes in this heat. Okay. I think rather than leaving this topic behind entirely and moving on to something completely different, what I'd like to do is first of all look over at the screen here and realize that a lot of empty space there. I want to either zoom this in further or possibly... Where is it? Alpha. Bigger. There we go. Make efficient... Yeah, let's do both. Make efficient use of this screen space. Just hope I remember to make myself small again next time I'm playing a video game so I don't take up a whole 1/5 of the screen. Okay. Rather than moving on from this topic entirely to something completely different, which we could, something I've been wanting to do some brainstorming on off-stream, but just kind of never found a moment for, which we can do now instead, is... Let's move on to a new page so we can start fresh with this. Sci-fi fantasy pantheons. Gods in a... Gods in a setting heavy with tech. Now, off the top of my head, the first thing that comes to mind when I think about something like this is Godbound, which is a setting that has advanced technology and very fancy stuff like that, but doesn't really interact with the magic and the gods in that regard. The gods, you know, in Godbound you play as a titular Godbound, someone who has claimed one of the words of creation and is on the path to getting more of them and becoming a proper god. Or even the god, capital G, sits on the throne. But none of the words that you have are, to the best of my memory, tech related. I think some of the words to do with creation or like artifice can make stuff, and I think you might be able to make technological things as well, but there aren't any specifically tech related ones. There is a word for a dragon, or a word of the fairy queen and stuff like that. There's one for magic, there's a bunch for different things of the natural world, like water or the sky or fertility, but there's not really... The setting doesn't interact with tech specifically. Besides that, it's been a long time since I read this rulebook, but I want to say Numenera has gods? Do I think the setting for that tabletop RPG is that it's like the far future and everyone has forgotten how technology works, and they think that all of this super science nanotech stuff they've got going on is actually magic. So again, there's not really any interaction here between the tech aspects and the gods and the divine aspects. So what do I want to do here? Setting nodes. What kind of just to give ourselves a framework to brainstorm within. I'm gonna say not post-apocalyptic, but similar vibes. Very decentralized and lots of ancient ruins and wilderness. More basically a fantasy setting, but in a era. Gods have specific domains, and I like to complicate things. There's two types of gods. Ascendant gods who were mortal originally, and descendant. Descendant is like descending from an ancestor, not. It doesn't really hold the same connotation of like this, like falling from not falling from grace, but descending from a higher realm. We'll keep it for now. We can come up with a better word later. And descendant gods who are some concept or higher or natural law personifying. And I want to make this split because it kind of allows for some freedom in terms of having certain gods work one way and certain gods work another way, which saves us from having to explain why the god of one particularly influential domain doesn't just use that domain to acquire whatever stuff they want, while another does use their domain in some ways. But like, for example, if we have gods of death, those will tend to be pretty powerful if we're in a world where they can influence things directly and stuff like that. So having this kind of divide does just mean we can have like concept gods that are very big and distant, and then more involved ones. Let's not get bogged down with that. So what do we want in here? Gods will probably have like a domain usually, maybe a couple different ones that they've branched into. Should the domains be related or really independent from each other? I'm always of two minds on this one, because I feel like both in terms of world building and storytelling have their advantages and disadvantages, and both are interesting in different ways. So for example, gods with very similar domains kind of make sense thematically. They've got a very they've got good branding, really. You look at them and look at their domains and you're like, oh yeah, I see how these things go together, I see how they would influence each other, why this god would want to be in charge of these various things. On the flip side, in a world where you can acquire or lose domains, potentially, it kind of makes more sense if really similar domains would just conglomerate together and become an overarching domain, and then gods would have very different domains that have nothing to do with each other, because if they had similar ones, they would just merge, right? There was one story I read called Art of Darkness by Ravensdagger over on Royal Road, where each kind of broad concept, like the highest in the hierarchy concept, could be broken down into a bunch of smaller ones, and essentially the more gods there were of various smaller concepts, the less power each individual god under that large umbrella had access to. Not an equal split. There was a place where it mentioned that there was one group of gods who specifically decided they'd be better off together because a trio of gods of these related things were stronger than the singular god of their combined concept, because they weren't at the very top of the chain. On the flip side, the goddess of darkness, who rules over like darkness and the night and monsters and stuff, is the singular god of darkness. There is no god of night, of shadows, of anything related to the dark, and she's incredibly powerful because of it. Now, I'm not going to implement that kind of system where there's higher or lower concepts. I think all the gods will be on fairly even footing in terms of their divine power. Any difference in strength between them will come from how strong that god is as an individual, how skilled are they with a weapon or with magic or whatever else. But it gives some food for thought in terms of how we structure the domains. In this case, I think we probably go with neither approach on the far ends of the spectrum and something closer to the middle, where gods can have whatever domain they want, or whatever the domain they manage to get their hands on, and a lot of them will simply, a lot of them will simply choose ones that are appropriate or related because it's more convenient for them in terms of, you know, keeping control of their followers or having influence in the world and stuff. Like if you're a patron god of some cities along the coast, then having your domains be travel, the sea, and weather is probably just very useful. I mean, multiple gods with... Oh, I'm getting... This was meant to be focused on what kind of domains could you have in a science fantasy setting, and now I'm getting completely bogged down in the particulars of how do the gods work in this kind of setting. Let's put a pin in all of this, perhaps, for a moment, and just think of some broad archetypes, I suppose. Like, you've got warrior gods in fantasy. What kind of stuff would I want in sci-fi? Yeah, what kind of theming do I want to give different gods in this setting? Off the top of my head, I would want some kind of god of pollution, some kind of creature that goes around rotting and making the landscape toxic and stuff like that. Maybe a little bit like Exor from Ferngully, if you remember that. The fantastic toxic love song. I'm just gonna have a drink real quick. Who sings that again? Was it Tim Curry? Yeah, Tim Curry sings that. Really good song. Yeah, a god of pollution. Corporate executives, I think, would work really well as an evil pantheon kind of thing. Obviously, you know, in terms of domains, gotta have guns, artillery, the internet, information, perhaps, that kind of thing. There is a certain advantage to the way Dungeons & Dragons does it, with a fairly limited list of divine domain, right? D&D 5e divine... Not the cleric domain. What gods can have access to? Not all of these are used anymore. Get to domains. 3.5 and 5th edition. If the guards enters a deity, such as magic and those who are faithful, clerics, yada yada. People good, okay, that's law domain. Portfolio. Control of things related to yeah, like broadly, gods picked like a couple of these, and they were not exclusive. You can have multiple gods of a particular domain, and I think you won't have more than one of a domain within each pantheon, but each pantheon kind of needs to cover various things within their area of influence. And that partially comes down to how the gods in the Forgotten Realms do seem to rule over specific places in the world rather than being omnipresent. Even if a follower can go to any part of the world and still have access to their divine powers, the gods themselves focus on particular places. Which is why I started getting immediately massively distracted by how exactly do the divine domains work, because that will influence what kind of gods you get out of it. The god of the apocalypse? Like, so these overarching... I'm using that language a lot, overarching and archetype, but these themes for gods will have probably multiple domains under them, right? Like maybe the god of the apocalypse has control over war, weapons of mass destruction, and fear as their domains, something like that. The evil pantheon of executives control, you know, wealth, business, and greed, something like that. The god of pollution might just have pollution singularly as their domain. I think we will note that down here. The god's power is not tied to what domains or how many they have. Will be independent of that. Would it be tied to how many worshippers they have? There's always a good one for giving motivation for gods to be active in the world. I feel like... No, undecided on that one. We'll revisit that in the future. God of pollution, several corporate executives, god of the apocalypse. I don't want these to be very rigid kind of design. You know, I don't want to be, oh, this is the god of the forge, and their thing is that they make stuff out of metal on a forge specifically, and that's what they're restrained to. They should have more variety and abilities within that, and they should be able to step outside of a theme to a certain extent as well. These are still people, very powerful people who've very powerful people who've achieved this and probably had reasons for becoming like this. There's a song by Luluyam called Divine CEO, which is very good, very much matches the kind of image I've got in my head for what these will be like. The guns, artillery, the internet, information. What else would make sense as a domain? An explosions domain, maybe? I feel like sometimes they feel a little too specific, a little too narrow. Like a nature domain is one thing. Is rivers too specific? I feel like not, but then that's just influence from real life, because there are river gods in real life, because each individual river is so important to the people living along it. Whereas god of the god whose divine domain is explosions, that just kind of feels silly to a certain extent. That feels gimmicky. Like, explosions, really? Maybe it's the temporary nature of an explosion, the fact that it's not a thing you can look at. The river is there, the guns, the information, they all kind of exist. Whereas an explosion is an event. A lot of explosives. See, that immediately seems much more interesting, much more sensible. Explosives, the materials, the bombs, the C4, the mines, etc. Those are specific things you can look at that you use as objects of devotion, that you can think about modifying with divine power, stuff like that. Definitely, as far as like guns and a god to cover that goes, I'm feeling heavily inspired by Laterano and the Sancta from Arknights. Absolutely has to be one of my favorite factions in anything ever. I mean, you have a bunch of angel-looking people with an obsession for sweets who all get given a gun when they come of age, and also they live in a city where you're allowed to do absolutely anything. The only rule is you have to file the appropriate paperwork beforehand. There's a bit from one of the Laterano events in Arknights where we're introduced to two like random background NPCs, two bystanders, who are having a discussion, and they're talking about how guests have been invited to Laterano from abroad. There's like a diplomatic conference going on, and the leader of the city, the Pope, has made a request for everyone to like hold back a bit while the guests are there. And the two of them basically go, well, you know, holding back is not the same thing as doing nothing at all. And also, by the way, you see that pillar over there? Really great architecture. What do you think it would look like if we blew it up? So they go file the paperwork and just detonate the pillar, because that's the thing you can do in Laterano. There's no rules. It's very, very funny. And also, for some reason, the angels all have an empathic bond with each other. They can sense each other's emotion. Which I don't think really comes up in the story all that much. It's not a super big point, except between like a couple characters. But I'm getting terribly sidetracked. What else can we think of here for potential tech or modern domains? Some would be probably pretty heavily changed, right? Like a god of travel. A god of travelers in a fantasy setting is like, oh, you know, please keep me safe from wolves at night, that kind of thing. As opposed to in a more modern setting, specifically the one that I kind of outlined here, what would you want instead? Keep you safe from the roaming bandits, except this time the bandits have artillery? Sort of Mad Max style vibes? I'm not sure. The presentation would definitely have to be very, very different. You know, gods of travel in fantasy tend to be travelers themselves, wanderers of some description or another, whereas a god of travel in something like this could be a car salesman. One second, let me just take a drink. Yeah, a car salesman, which is a very different vibe. On the flip side, you could have a god of travel who's all about enjoying the journey and not using some transportation that gets you just from A to B very, very quickly. Would make for an interesting character. Not sure though. Some of these are pretty specific, some of them are fairly broad. What would be very, very big gods? You know, your overall nature god. Like Mother Nature tends to be a very major god in a lot of pantheons, a lot of settings, just because nature is everywhere. The god of the sea tends to have power over all the oceans everywhere, not just specific ones, whereas a god of war, more often than not, is a local god of war. There's not so many who are all conflict everywhere. But like, even the ones who are supposed to be, like for example, Thorn in Warhammer, you know, his whole thing, like he cares not from where the blood flows as long as it does, still kind of doesn't cover all conflict or fighting. He's specifically getting lost in the fighting, and then other gods and other warp entities that are tied more specifically to the different races in Warhammer will tend to take precedence over Khorne when it comes to fighting. So which domains would be very, very broad? I feel like you might have a local god of the internet, but you'll have a global god of information. Satellites, possibly? Satellites up in the sky similar to the stars. You have different gods for the sun. You've got maybe a god of night, a god of a moon, god of the stars. Not really a god of day. Day just kind of gets folded into the domain of the sun. In Godbound, the tabletop RPG, you do have sky as a word you can take, which is separate from the sun. I think sky in that one is kind of a word for freedom and travel and being able to, having the limitless horizon, whereas the sun is all about the light and the burning and the cleansing, all-seeing truth kind of vibe. Maybe a god of misinformation. Memetics / info hazards could be an interesting domain as well. In the what's it called? In the web serial World Keeper, I think it's called? World Builder? World Keeper? I think it's World Keeper over on Royal Road. There's a kind of progression that worlds go through with different levels of power, and harnessing mimetic effects is one of the major tiers of power. It's quite interesting there, because in that setting they have gods beforehand who all ascend with a specific domain, and that domain can basically be any one word you can think of. Whatever word they pick for whatever domain they choose, they then can make powers related to it, and can get a lot of leeway in how closely related that power has to be. And they can get more than one domain. I think they start with one. If they get a second, it's unstable, but a third stabilizes them again. And then if they get more, they get increasingly unstable until they reach 9 domains, which is a trio of trios, and is very stable again, and then that's the cap. But once the mimetic stuff gets involved, and you get these mimetic monsters coming from the void, you also get void gods, who, same as the regular ones, also can pick basically any word as their domain, but they have an opposing power source to the regular gods, which I thought was quite interesting. I don't know whether I want to go as far as to let anything, any given word, be a domain. I think I'd like a little bit more of a restriction than that, but how much? What's a reasonable restriction? Because you can make anything sound grand enough if you really, really focus on it. Like, if you want to have a god of doorways, a doorway in itself is a very kind of dull thing. There's not much really to talk about there, it's a doorway. But if you make it all doorways in the world, all boundaries between buildings, the gateways into cities, etc., suddenly that's a lot of influence depending on what they can actually do with that. Can they just open and close doors? Can they remove them? Can they create them? Can they bar the door to a specific person? Suddenly we're looking at quite an influential god. Can they step into one doorway and come out of another? So it's a kind of omnipresent god who has the ability to travel places. But then should that really fall under the doorway domain? Or should we lock that power into someone who's more focused on travel? Would a god of boundaries be more appropriate? Because boundaries sounds like the kind of term that absolutely should have that kind of broad application. The separation of concepts and stuff. There's a bunch of things I've read, I think a few fanfics I've read of Yukari Yakumo from the Toho games, where she uses her ability to manipulate boundaries in all sorts of super creative ways that definitely make it seem like it would be fit for a divine domain. What would be a silly thing? What kind of thing? Because as I said, it feels like there should be some rules, but what kind of word would I actually look at and go, no, this shouldn't be a domain? Like, look, moving on from doors, windows don't really have the same cultural weight as doorways as an entryway, but then, you know, the window to the soul, would that fall under the domain of that particular god? It all depends on how conceptual we want to allow ourselves to be. When it gets a little bit more literal, then the domains have to be domains of things that have effects naturally. Like the god of rivers will be specifically tied to rivers, to flows of water. They're able to alter the flow of a particular river, but that's kind of it. They won't have access to, you know, the river of death, assuming such a thing even exists in this world, because that's simply not what's being referred to. It's just called a river for metaphor, unless there's a literal river there, and even if there is, their domain is rivers, not extracting souls from them. In that kind of setting, a god of doorways would exclusively be able to open and close and maybe create and vanish doorways. That's much more constrained. I think I might prefer that. Maybe as a sort of middle ground. You know, the gods are still powerful. These are all people who've managed to reach this level of power, so they're probably extremely powerful mages or whatever else they've used to get to the point of ascension. So a lot of their strength outside of their domain comes from what they personally are capable of, whereas the power of a domain is very specifically centered on what the thing is. Maybe we allow lesser domains, but then we have put here that power is not tied to domains, and this would go directly against that. Is there a solution that satisfies both points, that allows us to have both the but allows us to, in a satisfying manner, restrict what can and can't be a domain without clearly stating that some domains are objectively better and worse than others? The answer to that might be no. Like, you could have a god of cats, but then cats are very cool, and being in control of all cats, or be able to communicate with all cats or whatever, have every cat be your messenger, like, what's it called? Inari, the god of foxes in Shinto, probably pretty effective. But I wouldn't want like a god of flip-flops. That's silly. I do not want a god of flip-flops in my world. So how do we specify that that's not allowed, but the god of beetles maybe is, because they're part of a natural world and part of the biosphere and have much more impact that may. No god of flip-flops, no god of tissues or whatever else. What sets these apart, besides just one is silly and one is not? There really isn't anything, is there? The only thing separating them is that I don't like the idea of one of them because it sounds stupid for a divine domain, whereas the other one doesn't. So maybe this can't be the case. Maybe what specifically your domain is important. The other option, of course, is that... let me write that out. The other option... Domains there is a set list of domains. They are a part of the natural world, and only some are available. So you can be the god of guns because that's how the universe works. That is a domain that is an option. You can't be the god of flower pots because that's simply not a thing that exists within reality. We wouldn't even necessarily have to explain this. It can just be one of those things that is the way it is. Similar to, I don't know, how in an elemental magic system, the elements just are what they are. There's no explanation for why air, earth, wind, and fire are suitable, but I don't know. What else could you pick as an element? What else could you pick as an element? I don't know, glass? I don't think glass falls under anything. I don't believe earthbending extends to glass, does it? You can do the lava, I think. Is lava under firebending or earthbending? I know someone lava bends in like Legend of Korra, but I've never watched Legend of Korra, so I don't know which bending type that falls under. But you get what I mean. You know, there are rules about how the magic works, and those rules don't really have an explanation. There's no justification behind it. And in the same way, we don't have to explain why some domains are acceptable and others aren't. Let me just take a drink real quick. Option 1, we let anything can, so anything can be, let me start properly. 1. Anything can be a domain, but some will never be taken because they be weaker. Option 2. Some things can't be domains, or yet explain reasons. And option 3. There is a set list of domains, they are part of the natural world, and only some are available. I do believe that option 2 and 3 are two different ones, even though they seem very similar, because I feel like option 2 comes with the expectation that there will be an explanation. We will have to come up with a reason for why we can't take the fence post domain. Maybe the answer to that is because we kind of combine it with the first one. Anything can become a domain in theory. In practice, only some things can, because you have to use the power you draw from that domain in the process of ascension. Solution. Anything can be a domain, but in order to ascend, you have to use the concept you are trying to bond with to gain a certain amount of power. If the concept doesn't hold enough weight in the world and doesn't lead into any abilities you can make use of, and you will fail to meet the threshold and be unable to ascend. Now this has a minimal amount of wishy-washiness in regards to what makes something hold conceptual weight in the world, but I think that's fine in a world where we're allowing magic, because the existence of magic comes with certain questions about how the universe fundamentally works that just don't get touched in world building ever, basically. And I'm not about to try and answer those questions either. I think I've talked about it in some streams a few months ago. Basically, for example, if you want to cast a spell that opens the lids to a bunch of jars, that doesn't seem like a very complicated concept, right? Like, if you're in a high fantasy magic setting, then some powerful wizard putting a spell together to open jars, it's like the that one classic Disney animation, Sorcerer's Apprentice, where you use all that magic to make the tools come to life and start cleaning. That's easy, low-level wizard magic in a high fantasy magic can do anything kind of setting. But actually think about for a second. If you're constructing a spell, how on earth is your magic defining what a jar is, what a lid is, what the opening means? How does magic understand what it is you're doing? Because these are things that you run into in our world, in computer science and programming, and they're extremely, incredibly complicated. Worst of all, because we as humans can't even successfully define these things in a way that pleases everybody. If you put something down in front of someone, some people are going to say that it's a jar, some people are going to be specific, they're going to say it's a mason jar, some people are going to call it a cup. It's like the difference between calling a drink soda or cola or pop. These things might all refer to the same liquid, but people will insist that they're not called the other thing, they're called what Dave just called it. And yeah, once you start to think about that, and it just gets worse and worse and more complicated, and magic makes less and less sense, and we are not going to try and solve that here. We will simply take shameless advantage of it and say that certain concepts have more weight. They have more conceptual weight. That's a concept that you... The concept of conceptual weight is a concept that you run into all of the time in fantasy. Lots of power systems that focus on comprehension and gaining strength through your understanding of a specific thing talk about this kind of thing. It's very popular in cultivation novels as well, in sort of Eastern Zhangxia and stuff like that, where if you want to be the best swordsman around, you have to study the concept of swords, you have to understand the act of cutting, the swinging of the blade, and as your understanding of the concept grows, you somehow become able to make sharper cuts and have a better blade form. So that's the kind of thing that we're looking at here. You could become the god of boundaries, because those fall on a lot of stuff, including, you know, the divisions between communities, between countries, the boundary between what is and isn't acceptable. It's a very broad term. It can also refer to the boundary around a field. You could not, however, become the god of fence posts or fences, because the fence is just an object used to separate those two, used to draw the boundary. It falls under the umbrella of the term that you would actually want to ascend with. I don't think that stops us from having specific domains that overlap, or domains that would fit within other domains. You can become a god of water and you can become a god of rivers, because those have very different connotations attached to them, I think. Right? If the river is made of water, or the water is contained within the river, but both are separate things. If that makes sense. It's like how, what's a good comparison for this? It's like how an egg, when you look at one, in the shell laying there, and an egg cracked into a pan, are both eggs, but they're clearly not the same thing. And if you had power over one, you would not necessarily be expected to have power over the other. A fried egg and a boiled egg are both egg, but they're not the same thing. And in the same way, a river or the ocean or water are all water, but they're not the same thing. So this is what we will go with here for the question of what domains are and aren't acceptable. Now, do the ones that we've got listed down here already meet these criteria? A god of pollution whose domain probably would be pollution. Yeah, that fits. That's a very broad, powerful term, affects a lot of places. A pantheon of evil CEOs who've risen to divinity. Yeah, if their domains are, money and greed or whatever, that fits. God of the Apocalypse, what did I say earlier? Domains being like weapons of mass destruction, war, and fear. Very, very broad, very powerful terms. A god of misinformation whose domains are lies or falsehood, some variation of that. That works out. Then for the domains down here, guns, absolutely, that works. Artillery, maybe. I think artillery is probably enough of its own thing, but it would work. Domain of heavy weapons? No. I feel like I could see a cleric focused on artillery following a god of weapons, but a god of artillery specifically? No, that one goes off the list. It's gone. Domain of the internet? Yes, that works. Information, very broad. I mean, information could be a domain in a regular fantasy setting. I think that wouldn't be an issue. It's just not the kind of thing you think about in a fantasy setting necessarily. God of explosives, is that similar to artillery, just a little bit too limited? If I had written God of bombs, I feel like it would obviously be a concept with enough weight, just because of like nuclear weapons. But then bombs are explosives, nuclear weapons fit under this, and yet it feels like reaching for... It feels like using nukes in this domain's context feels like a reach. It feels like you're stretching to have that included, even though it clearly isn't. A mine or some C4 or whatever definitely fits under explosives. But then a bomb doesn't, TNT does, I think, yeah. Comes down to a lot of personal interpretation, which can be a bit of an issue with something like this, where some parts of the audience are simply going to full-on disagree with you on what a reasonable interpretation is. I think if artillery went, explosive probably have to go as well, and bombs would not be a valid one either. A god of weapons would work. It's not like you get gods of swords in fantasy necessarily. I mean, unless you're reading Kill 6 Billion Demons, in which case swords are everything. but you don't really get a god of the sword in a general fantasy setting. You might get a god of war, a much broader thing which covers weapons. I think with the amount of variety and power in modern weaponry, and just how hugely unrelated to each other they can be, a god of weapons would make sense in this case. But a god of artillery, god of explosives, would guns make sense then? Guns can also be really, really, really broad. But would they be broad enough? Probably not either. Probably not either on guns. Travel, yeah, travel absolutely fits. Satellites then. Because we seem to be taking all of the objects off of our list. That seems to be the recurring pattern here. A specific object just doesn't quite make the cut. So would satellites get subsumed into, you know, the god of the internet, the god of networks? Let's put networks on the list. Would satellites get subsumed? When I put it on the list earlier, I brought up and was thinking about various things in the sky. How we have gods of the sun, not necessarily a god of day, but we do have gods of night, we have gods of the moon. Not really gods of the stars, do we? There aren't gods of stars. You get constellations, and they can be tied to specific gods, or they can even be gods in their own right. But I don't know that I've ever really heard of a god of the stars. I think the only time I've seen a god of stars was in one specific My Little Pony fanfic I read, where Twilight Sparkle becomes the Alicorn of stars, instead of the night just being in general ruled over by Luna, who's technically the Alicorn of the moon, not of the night. Same way Celestia is the sun, not the day. I'll ask you kindly not to judge me for reading My Little Pony fanfic, thank you very much. So yeah, not really stars, and stars are the comparison we're drawing on for satellites. So maybe it would make more sense to fold satellites in as being like different networks of satellites are like constellations for gods of memetics and the internet and stuff like that. So that seems to be a fairly consistent rule for our domains, not specific objects. But there must be some, because we're allowing... Well, water is a material, I guess, more than anything. You can have a god of metal and have them be making guns. You can have a god of rivers, but rivers are places. They're features of a landscape, same as a mountain. Would it be a big... Cities? Cities are very big. Cities, I mean, lots of cities in history have had their own local gods, so a god of cities would work. Is it a matter of scale then? Or is it that they're places instead of objects? An arbitrary distinction, technically speaking. You know, sometime in the far future of humanity we might have colossal terraforming spaceships that rip mountains out of a landscape, plonk them down somewhere else. But in that case you could have an entire ship hold full of mountains, right? Could you have a god of ships? Could you? Maybe not. I think that's not unheard of. I want to say ships have had deities in some belief or other. I couldn't name one off the top of my head. But also you can stack a bunch of ships on a bigger ship to ferry them around. They're definitely objects, they're things. A god of harbors? Related to ships, related to cities? I don't think you would have a god of harbors. I think that's too specific. I think this world specifically here wouldn't have a god of ships. They're too small scale. Would you have a god of planets? That's probably too large scale. We are doing sci-fantasy here, but we're not doing FTL fantasy. There's not going to be travel between planets. Really, the only setting I've ever seen that did that in a way that I enjoyed has been Starfinder. Starfinder was quite fun. It was very weird because I never got into Pathfinder and really bounced off Pathfinder 2nd edition. I went on the Archive of Nephis and I spent like hours theory crafting characters, and I just could not put together a set of abilities that felt I just could not put together a set of abilities that felt like it let me play the character I wanted, like it let me do all of the things I wanted to be able to do. On the flip side, in Starfinder, it felt really easy to put together someone who had all the abilities I wanted. I ran a one-shot in Starfinder and it was quite enjoyable. That setting really worked for me, but for some reason Pathfinder and 2nd edition just didn't click. But yes, Starfinder, very good setting for science fantasy, and one that I think manages to have a bunch of different planets and not fall into a Planet of Hats kind of trap in terms of its world building, and also preserve a lot of the fantasy aspects. For me, in this particular case and what we're building here, I think I'll stick very firmly to one planet. It might be a funky planet and we might do some upper atmosphere in orbit stuff. No going to the moon though. Like at most we might have a planetary ring, which is, I know is a ridiculous piece of technology for a non-starfaring civilization. It doesn't make any sense, but there are gods involved so we can get away with it. But nothing further than that. Just some basic rocketry. I recently started playing Armored Core 6, and I gotta say, the intro cutscene for that, those massive platforms out in space around the planet, beautiful imagery. Definitely one of the things that's inspiring this particular setting and my thoughts about it. Same with that Marathon has been feeding into it, and Cyberpunk 2077 and Edge Runners. For the time being, we are coming up on 2 hours, and my room keeps getting hotter and hotter. I've still got the windows closed so that the noise from the cars outside doesn't interrupt. It is getting too much to take. So I think for today, I will go ahead and thank you all very much for watching. It's Wednesday now, so hopefully I can squeeze in another stream tomorrow or Friday. Not sure yet what we'll do, we'll see. For now, thank you very much for watching, and I shall see you all next time.